Welcome to the TSD Mindfulness video for teaching number 17. So this teaching we're still talking about how to tame the mental field. And this teaching is become mindful of the forms in your mind. Become mindful of the forms in your mind. So let's think about the mental field for a moment. Our mental field is valuable in our lives, right? I mean, if it weren't for our prefrontal cortex and our ability to organize and make decisions, that life would be very weird and strange, probably. So it's valuable. Our mental field is valuable. However, our mental field can get a bit carried away at times. It can be doing all of this organizing and projecting into the future and reflecting on the past too much, especially during meditation or another contemplative activity. So we do need to tame our mental field so we can move our consciousness into our hearts, especially when we're in our meditation practice. We're taming our mental field so we can move our consciousness into our hearts. And we want to move our consciousness into our hearts so we can enter a healing process, so we can enter a joyful experience. So I have a question for you. Where do you believe thoughts come from? Where do our thoughts come from? You can think of the teachings, the things that I've covered so far in these videos. You might think about the subconscious, trauma, fight or flight episodes. Where do our thoughts come from? And another question is, how do we step away from interacting with our thoughts? How do we stop interacting with our thoughts? Because that is the mindfulness approach. That's what we're doing with mindfulness, is we're becoming aware of what's going on, aware of our thoughts, but we're also learning how to minimize our interaction with our thoughts. We're just in awareness. We're not involved. We're just aware. So where do our thoughts come from? There's lots of different ways to explain this. I've talked about logic. Logic generates thoughts. Our instinct also generates thoughts. So, for example, we have a thought about something being not good, something along those lines. And that thought was generated because we have this logic that, if we're in this situation, then things should play out this way. So we get disappointed, and then we have some disappointment type thoughts, for example, or some frustration type thinking. Your gut gets triggered, your nervous system gets triggered because maybe your reputation was put into question. And when our nervous system is triggered, it does instigate certain types of thinking. And that's something you can become more and more mindful of, is what type of thinking do I go into when my nervous system gets activated? That can be very enlightening. And you can get to the point that you can think, oh, well, I'm in this type of thinking because my nervous system is activated. Once I soothe myself, calm myself down, I probably won't be in this type of thinking anymore. Years ago, I had a meditation during which I saw a thought being born. It was really incredible. So that's one thing that happens with mindfulness, is things just slow down. It's just the speed of everything becomes so slow. And the way I experienced this is sitting there meditating, and it wasn't literally like this, but this is the best way to describe it, is imagine a gallon of paint and you pour that paint on something very flat like glass or something. So you have this really smooth surface of paint. So that was kind of what it felt like. And then there was this symbol that came out of that paint and developed. And the symbol was a hammer. A hammer came out of that. And then I observed a thought come from that symbol. And to this day, I can't remember what that thought was, but it definitely was a hammer. So I do think that thoughts can kind of develop in our consciousness symbolically from symbols. And I also believe that because of my background as a hypnotherapist. So that's one way to think about how thoughts come about. I say all this to prepare you for this idea, which is a Buddhist idea, which is called form versus content. What we are doing is we're observing these forms in our mind instead of engaging in the content of your thoughts. So that's a little bit abstract. I'll go into that. We're observing the forms in our consciousness instead of engaging in the content of our thoughts. And the content of our thoughts is the story of our thoughts. So it's very Buddhist to take a step back and stop interacting with your thoughts and just kind of observe from this observational place. So let me share my screen to kind of go into more detail about what I mean here. This handout, form versus content, that you have access to if you're in one of the TSD mindfulness programs. The content of our thoughts represents the story that our thoughts are telling. The form of our thoughts is a little bit more abstract. So here's an example. So let's say the content of our thoughts is, I don't like my carpet. Or let's just say that's the thought. I don't like my carpet. The story there is, I'm really not liking my carpet for whatever reason. But the form of that, the more abstract part of that is red, the color red. My carpet is red. Just you see that the simplicity of that. Another example is chai is my favorite latte. So it's a little bit of a story that chai is my favorite latte, but the form of that might be spice scent. It's more the abstract simplicity of it. When your alarm rings in the morning for you to wake up, that's kind of the story. Oh, I need to wake up. I need to get out of bed is the story. The content, the form of that is just simply a high-pitched sound. It's just the simplicity of that. So that's one way to think of the difference between content and form. When Buddhists practice meditation for a long time, they will often report that they don't really experience their thoughts as stories anymore. Instead, they feel kind of like a wave. It's just kind of like this wave going through your mind. Okay, so building this up here. So this is a technique. And what you would do here is you would think of some type of symbol, some type of form that could be an abstract representation of the story in your mind. Let's say you had a difficult conversation on the phone with someone before you sat down to your meditation practice. You're sitting down and you're meditating, and you are kind of all about this conversation and the story and those thoughts. And sometimes when that happens, it's really hard to just kind of settle into our meditation. It's kind of hard to settle out of that thinking. So this technique can be really helpful in that situation. And so what you would do is you would come up with a symbolic image that represents all those thoughts about that conversation. It could be a prickly ball. It could be a wave. It could be a cloud, whatever it is that you choose. And so you imagine that form, that symbol, and you kind of imagine encapsulating those thoughts, but really it's those thoughts. It's just you're viewing it in a different way. It's in this abstract form. Have somebody who's meditating, they're imagining this sphere representing that type of thinking. And then this person is able to continue with your meditation. This person is distracted by work thoughts, exist as this symbol. So this is how you can use this technique. So hopefully if you do this, what can happen is you're creating a space for the energy of those thoughts, because we don't want to really push things away. You're creating a space for the energy of these thoughts, but it's a more nonverbal, more abstract experience. I'll tell another story that might help. In the past, when I've taught mindfulness meditation, I have played a clip of a Seinfeld episode, just a really short clip, maybe 45-second clip of a scene in a Seinfeld episode. And I asked my students to just watch it. And they do, and they notice the story, and they get involved in what Kramer's talking about and what happened to him. And then I played the clip again and I say, this time I want you to back up from the story. And instead of paying attention to the story, I want you to pay attention to the pitches of the people's voices. I want you to pay attention to the colors and the objects in that scene, pay attention to the shapes. And so then they watch it again and it's a different experience. They're not caught up in the story, but they're there and they're noticing more of the abstract forms of it. And people notice things that they didn't notice the first time. They notice a bike hanging in the background. They notice the cereal boxes that are on top of Seinfeld's refrigerator, things like that. But we can do that in our everyday life. You could be walking down the street and in your head in a story, and then you say, well, no, I'm actually going to look at more of the abstract experience of this. I'm going to look at the sidewalk. The sidewalk is gray. I see the lines. I see the tree that's in front of me, right? So you're stepping away from the story and into what I call that more abstract, but yet very real experience that's going on around you, being in the present moment, being with what's going on right now. So we disengage from our thoughts when we stop paying attention to the story that they tell. So this is a big part of the process, is disengaging from our thinking. We disengage from the thinking when we disengage from the story that they tell. Can you allow the thinking to still kind of be there, but not be engaged with the story? Something to try during your next meditation or during your next little bout of mindfulness. So this concludes the video for teaching number 17.